The civilization of ancient Egypt. It inspires endless fascination. It's a land of pharaohs, deities, pyramids, and hidden knowledge. And indeed, for all that we have learned from the hieroglyphic texts left behind and the archaeological digs in our modern age, Egypt still retains many of its unsolved mysteries. How did those laborers in ancient times quarry, move, and lift millions of stone blocks to build the monuments with such precision? What happened to fabled cities like Pi-Ramesses and Akhenaten that flourished briefly, only to be swallowed by the sands of time? And where are the lost tombs of illustrious figures, the resting places of Cleopatra VII, the mummy of Nefertiti, the burial of the master architect Imhotep? What secrets would those tombs reveal? Egypt's artifacts themselves pose their own riddles. A wooden bird that some claim is a model glider, carved reliefs that resemble modern light bulbs, ancient discs of unknown purpose, and cryptic papyri hinting at forbidden knowledge. And even its language and religion hold their own enigmas, from the elusive meanings of certain hieroglyphic inscriptions and the spells from the Book of the Dead to the unprecedented monotheism of Akhenaten's sun cult and the true significance of divine symbols and ritual. What does it all mean? Well, we're not exactly sure, but maybe we're on the right track. What we're going to do today is look through some of Egypt's hidden mysteries, the things that have puzzled historians, archaeologists, and perhaps a few conspiracy theorists alike. But we can't dismiss them just yet. We're yet to have all the information. So, let's take a look at the mysteries of ancient Egypt together. And before we do, allow me to issue the customary welcome to the channel. If you are here for your first time, well, you might want to click that subscribe button. Also leave a like and a comment for the algorithm. And by the way, you won't get any interruptions in this video, or indeed any other videos on the channel, because it's all mid-roll free. No ads to stop the experience or interrupt your rest or learning. It's because we are proudly supported by those on Patreon, YouTube memberships, the merch store, which has a very nice selection of little Egypt things too, and also the occasional donation on Super Thanks through YouTube and the PayPal link. Now with that in mind, all said and done, spread the word, tell your friends, and we may begin. Of course, why don't we build out from that foundation of the most imposing landmarks in the Egyptian skyline, the pyramids? Now, of course, we found out quite a lot about the pyramids and the engineering of them. The problem is, the more we think we've figured it out, the more little details we discover, and the whole theory gets turned on its head all over again. Of course, they're one of the most iconic unsolved engineering challenges from antiquity. They were constructed over 4,500 years ago, although some people think they're a bit earlier than that. But generally, in a historical context, we look at 4,500 years. Now, these colossal tombs provoke a question, and a fairly obvious one. How did a Bronze Age society manage such precision along with such scale? Let's look at the Pyramid of Khufu, rising about 146 meters originally. It was built from roughly 2.3 million stone blocks, and each one averaged from 2 to 15 tons. Archaeological evidence now paints a clearer picture of the labor and logistics involved, even if some techniques remain debated. Far from the slave labor myth popularized by Herodotus, excavations reveal a workforce of skilled Egyptian laborers, organized into crews, and even well provided for by the state. In the late 20th centuries, Egyptologist Mark Lehner uncovered a vast worker settlement at Giza. a lost city of the pyramids, with barracks and bakeries that likely housed thousands of laborers and specialists just southwest of the plateau. Remains of bread ovens, fish and cattle bones indicate these workers had plentiful rations, including prime cuts of beef, supplied by a centralized economy. Now this contradicts the old notion of slaves toiling under the whip. Instead, it suggests a organized labor tax, or perhaps a corvée system, where crews from different nomes, or that is, provinces, took turns in building during the flood season when farming couldn't be done. Of course, the Nile River inundates, and well, you're not going to be doing much farming underwater, aren't you? A graffiti and burials of those workers near the pyramid further show that they were respected Egyptians. They were not slaves, often buried with honors near the sacred site that they helped construct. Now, of course, this was one of the prevailing myths about Egypt for a long, long time, that the slaves built the pyramids. Of course, we know now that it was just not true, in any sense of the word. Well, perhaps there might have been some slavery to a certain point, but it's really nothing that we can prove on a historical level. In any case, let's move on from that. Now let's look at the construction process. It required quarrying limestone and granite, transporting blocks, and lifting them into place with astonishing accuracy. Egyptians lacked iron tools, so pyramid builders relied on copper chisels and saws, stone hammers, wooden sledges, ropes, and good old-fashioned muscle. One recently discovered papyrus diary has illuminated the logistics behind Khufu's pyramid construction. In 2013, archaeologists unearthed at Wadi al-Yarf on the Red Sea coast the logbook of an official named Merer, dating to year 27 of Khufu's reign. What a find that would have been. And 2013, so, well, only 12 years ago. Merer supervised a team of about 200 boatmen. They were ferrying limestone blocks from the Tura quarries to Giza via the Nile and canals. His journal details loading stone at Tura and sailing upriver to what he called the horizon of Khufu. What he was referring to, of course, was the Great Pyramid. This was a trip of 2 to 3 days. Now here's something important. Merer notes reporting to Ankh-Haf, Khufu's half-brother, who was chief for all the works of the king, confirming the involvement of high royal officials in managing pyramid construction. And this papyrus is our oldest inscribed eyewitness account of pyramid building, and it corroborates archaeological hypotheses that the Egyptians built a temporary harbor or canal at Giza to receive the heavy materials. Indeed, traces of an ancient canal and basin have been detected north of the Giza pyramids, indicating boats could approach closer to the plateau than the modern Nile allows. The ability to move multi-ton blocks by river barges and then by sledges lubricated with water across the desert, that's certainly a key innovation, and I'm sure you'll admit, quite clever for the time. Workers likely hauled stones on sledges up earth ramps, using ropes and perhaps wooden lever devices as no pulleys existed. And a recent discovery in 2018 at the Hadnub alabaster quarry in Middle Egypt revealed a 4,500-year-old ramp system with stairways and post holes on either side. Archaeologists Yanis Gordon and team found that by using a sled mounted with a large stone block and ropes tied to wooden posts, workers could drag blocks up very steep inclines, 20% grade or even more. What a system! A central ramp flanked by a staircase-like rows of post holes. It suggests a mechanism for hauling heavy stone upward, potentially analogous to methods for pyramid construction, not destruction, excuse me. Now, while the Hatnub ramp was for quarrying softer alabaster, it does show the principle of using man-powered sleds and rope pulleys to overcome gravity. Egyptologists theorize that similar ramps, whether straight, zigzagging up, or the pyramid sides or corkscrew ramps within the structure, were used to raise the masonry courses as the pyramid grew. No traces of the large external ramps survive. Perhaps they were dismantled or eroded. It's certainly been a few thousand years, so kind of hard to not erode. Of course, that fuels alternative theories from the water lift systems to even alien intervention. Rather famously, from the Ancient Aliens documentary aired by the, quote, History Channel, unquote. Well, the consensus still favors the simple elegance of earthen ramps and human force, given discoveries like Hatnub. And as one Egyptologist quipped, the ancient builders didn't leave an instruction manual, likely intentionally. It was a state secret, something that the Egyptians wanted to keep to themselves, perhaps. So, our understanding has to evolve as new evidence appears. But we can't just run away with outlandish theories. That being said, there's a few worldly theories that we can't dismiss just yet. But some of the more outlandish ones I think we can put in the no pile. But here's one that is interesting. It is the astronomical alignment, and just in general the preparation of the site. That is another enduring mystery of how the pyramids were aligned so precisely to cardinal directions. The Great Pyramid's sides are actually oriented almost exactly north, south, east, and west. And that's with an error of only a few arcminutes, that is a fraction of a degree. Now, achieving this with Stone Age surveying equipment seems to be quite remarkable, and that's because it is remarkable. A lot of this has led to a lot of speculation. Scholars have proposed that Egyptian surveyors used the circumpolar stars or the sun's shadow to find true north. Could be. One plausible method is observing the position of a star like Kochab or Mizar as it circles the north celestial pole. By marking its position at rising and setting and bisecting the angle, they could pinpoint north. And there's another method too, the solar gnomon technique, tracking a rod's shadow at equal morning and afternoon lengths, which gives a true north-south line at midpoint. The consensus, however, is that the pyramid builders had a sophisticated grasp of astronomy and geometry to orient their monuments, more than a lot of modern observers give them credit for, and they also achieved extraordinary accuracy in leveling the foundations. The base of Khufu's pyramid is almost perfectly flat, with only minimal differences in elevation across the 230-meter span. Some researchers do speculate that the Egyptians may have used water-filled trenches or channels as a leveling tool. Of course, water will always seek a level plane, no matter what vessel it's in. Well, when preparing the bedrock platform, this would have been quite a useful tool. And indeed, the bottom courses of the Great Pyramid were cut into the natural limestone plateau after careful leveling, creating a stable platform. This meticulous site preparation meant that the massive weight of the pyramid was evenly distributed, likely one reason that the structures have stood for so long without significant tilting or structural failure. Now, that is not to say that all pyramids had this precise engineering. There's plenty of, Sudan has more pyramids than Egypt. You don't hear about that very much, but they do. They're just on a smaller scale. And of course, there's plenty of monuments in Egypt that have crumbled away, fallen down. But when we talk about the pyramids of Giza, that's, well, when we say pyramids, that's what we think of. In any case, When casing stones, that is polished Tura limestone, covered the pyramid, the monument would have gleamed brilliantly in the sun and have been geometrically symmetrical. The alignments and execution were so precise that some have wondered if they had help from advanced technology or even extraterrestrials, once again a notion firmly rejected by archaeologists and historians, 99% of them. Well, perhaps not 99, but you know what I mean. In general, people favor the hypothesis of human ingenuity. But unfortunately, no written plans or blueprints from the Pyramid Age survive, at least ones that we have managed to discover yet, forcing researchers to have to reverse engineer methods from the physical evidence that we have. Well, the next thing we have is a few unexplained features, internal passages, secret rooms, things like this. And that certainly opens up not only the imagination of the historian, but the treasure hunter. So even with modern mapping, there are parts of the pyramids that remain unexplored. In 2017, a team of physicists and archaeologists with the Scan Pyramids project made a headline-grabbing discovery. They discovered a large void hidden deep within Khufu's Great Pyramid. That's right, a big old empty space. Using muon tomography, that is a cosmic ray imaging technique akin to X-rays, they detected a cavity at least 30 meters long above the Grand Gallery. The purpose of this cavity is still unknown. It could be a hidden chamber, a revealing space to lighten the weight on the gallery, or a byproduct of construction. Now fast forward to 2023, the Scan Pyramids team also identified and accessed a corridor-shaped void just behind the north face of the Great Pyramid, not far from the original entrance. An endoscopic camera revealed a narrow tunnel with a gabled roof, untouched since constructions. Well, speculatively, this corridor might have been built to redistribute weight or could conceivably lead to another sealed chamber that is yet to be found. These high-tech revelations show that the pyramids may still conceal a few secrets yet, even after over 200 years of archaeology in its more modernized sense. Napoleon was the one who really kicked off Egyptian archaeology, by the way. In any case, the notable thing is the mummy of Khufu himself has never been found either. His sarcophagus lies empty in the king's chamber, and that suggests that his remains were looted in antiquity, which was pretty common, unfortunately. Most of what we have is all gone, and the only reason why Tutankhamun is so famous is because his was a tomb that wasn't robbed. Otherwise, he was a pretty minor ruler, died quite young, didn't really accomplish anything. But, well, he left behind quite a nice little treasure room. Well, could some hidden recesses still contain parts of Khufu's burial goods, or perhaps clues to his funerary ritual? That's a very good question. That's the kind of question which we base our further explorations of. And while details of construction techniques remain debated, i.e. whether straight ramps on one face, a spiraling internal ramp, or multiple lifting levers, the overall picture is of a society that mobilized enormous resources and ingenuity to achieve these engineering marvels. And the mystery is not whether the ancient Egyptians built the pyramids. We know that they did, but how exactly they accomplished it, and what knowledge might have been lost in the process. In any case, each new discovery that we make, from the logbook of Mera to the muon-detected chambers, it brings us that little step closer to understanding this feat. But some aspects may remain secret, I suppose. The secret of those pyramid builders 4,500 years ago, concealed beneath millions of stones, and perhaps controversial opinion. maybe it's better that it's left that way. After all, Egypt is interesting because of its mysteries. Maybe when we discover them, the answers might be a little lukewarm, not as exciting as we thought. Of course, if we've got pyramids that stand out very obviously, well, there's also other monuments that go a little bit more unnoticed. The shifting sands of time have buried entire cities, some lost to history until recent times. We have two remarkable royal capitals, Pi-Ramesses in the Delta, and Akhet-Aten, also known as Amarna in Middle Egypt, and they epitomize the mystery of cities that flourished briefly and then just vanished, leaving scant traces and even more questions. Pi-Ramesses. Let's look at that first. The vanished capital of Ramesses the Great. We find ourselves in the 13th century BCE. Pharaoh Ramesses II built a glittering new capital in the northeastern delta called Pi-Ramesses. That is, of course, the House of Ramesses. Ancient records describe it as opulent, with temples and bustling harbors on the Nile, a thriving cosmopolitan city with a large population. Now, what is unusual is that this great city virtually disappeared from memory. By the first millennium BCE, it was forgotten. No one knew where it was, and this led early archaeologists on quite a wild goose chase, kind of like the ancient Egyptian version of Finding Troy, that kind of thing. In the 1880s and early 1900s, excavations at Tanis, modern-day San el Hagar, uncovered large Ramesside statues and temple stones, so scholars long misidentified Tanis as Pi-Ramesses, a confusion popularized in fiction too. Tanis, by the way, is the lost city sought in Indiana Jones, blending the two sides. Well, of course, we're not going to throw Indiana Jones away. Well, at least not the first few films. The modern films were not good. Rest in peace to that franchise. Another victim. Well, anyway, the true Pi-Ramesses remained hidden until the mid-20th century, when evidence pointed to Cantir, about 30 kilometers south of Tanis. Extensive magnetometry and excavations at Cantir have since mapped streets, foundations of vast temples, and even royal stables, confirming this was indeed the capital of Ramses II. But why then? Why was it abandoned? That's the real question. Why build this big city and then just leave? Well, it appears that its fate was caused by nature. The Paleocene branch of the Nile that had fed Pi-Ramesses canals began to silt up and shift course after Ramesses' era. Within a century or so of its founding, the once great waterfront city was left high and dry. By around 1100, Egypt's rulers relocated the administrative capital to Tanis, nearer the Nile's new course, and in doing so, they literally recycled Pi-Ramesses. Archaeological findings show that many monuments and building blocks were uprooted and transported to Tanis to construct new temples. Some temples at Tanis are built of stones bearing Ramesses II's cartouches that clearly originated in Pi-Ramesses, indicating an ancient urban transplant. And just quickly, that word cartouche, the French word for bullet, I believe it's a French word for bullet or casing, something like that. You will find these bullet-shaped frames for names of Egyptian royalty on a lot of the tombs, so the French archaeologists called these cartouches. You'll hear this quite a lot in Egyptology. Thus, we can certainly say that Pi-Ramesses did not so much collapse as it did migrate, and not just the population, the infrastructure cannibalized to create a successor city in a more prime real estate location is free real estate. Well, today, the fields of Cantir still hold the foundations of Ramesses City, detectable by remote sensing, but certainly difficult to excavate fully, as the area is near the water table. And then there's the modern villagers. Regardless of any historical discoveries, people don't like their houses being ripped up, so what are you going to do? In any case, the mystery of Ramesses lies in its rapid rise and fall, how a metropolis was the pride of Egypt's greatest empire, and how it could be largely erased. Only in the recent decades has scholarship untangled the clues and identified its remains. Ongoing digs keep going too, continuing to unearth workshops, and possibly the palace of Ramesses II itself. Actually, recently they found a trove of horse bits and chariot parts too. Quite befitting for a city famous for chariots. Yet much of Ramesses may remain under mud, groundwater, a little difficult to get to, and who knows how much of it is left. The full grandeur of this lost capital is still being pieced together. It shows that even mighty cities can vanish when geography, politics, and ultimately Mother Nature begins to shift their mood. Well, next we have another royal city that has passed into legend, Akhenaten, built by Pharaoh Akhenaten around 1346 BCE. Now, unlike Ramesses, whose memory persisted in distorted form, Akhenaten was deliberately excised from official history, a city of profound religious significance that was abandoned and almost forgotten until modern archaeology resurrected it. Now, as for Akhenaten, originally Amenhotep IV, he was the one who founded Akhenaten, meaning horizon of the Aten, as the center of his revolutionary monotheistic religion venerating the sun disk called Aten. Quite controversial at the time, basically throwing away the entire Egyptian pantheon. He was not very popular. He did select an undeveloped site on the east bank of the Nile, roughly halfway between Memphis and Thebes, marked by a semicircle of cliffs that form a natural horizon. Boundary stelae he carved into the cliffs recorded that he chose this site specifically to belong to Aten, free of any other deity's claim. And within a few years, indeed a splendid new city sprang up. Akhenaten was designed with Aten's worship in mind. Its temples had open courtyards with altars exposed to sunlight, rather than dark inner sanctums containing gods' statues. The great Aten Temple and small Aten Temple dominated the central city, alongside the royal palaces. Archaeologists have excavated the remains of wide processional roads down which Akhenaten rode his chariot daily to bathe in Aten's rays. Residential quarters, offices, gardens, vibrant artisans' workshops, they had it all, and they were all producing the distinctive Amarna art. And the art itself, that is quite mysterious, depicting the royal family in an exaggerated, almost caricatured style, with elongated heads and limbs, pot-bellies, and androgynous features. Some scholars theorize this unique style might reflect medical conditions, suggesting that Akhenaten had a kind of genetic disorder. But most now interpret it as more of a symbolic thing, emphasizing how the king's divine nature and the fertile boundary of the Aten. So for about 16 years, the city of Akhenaten buzzed with life and the radical energy of Akhenaten's religious experiment. But that only lasted until Akhenaten died, after 17 years on the throne. The experiment seems to have went to the grave with him. His young successor, the boy king Tutankhaten, later, by the way, named Tutankhamun, abandoned Akhenaten around 1332, under the pressures to restore the gods of the old pantheon. The court and capital relocated back to Thebes and Memphis, and Akhenaten was left to the whims of the desert. Later pharaohs, disdaining Akhenaten as a heretic, intentionally dismantled parts of the city. Akhenaten's name and the city's name were omitted from the king's lists. His temples were razed, and the stone talatat blocks reused in new constructions elsewhere. This purposeful erasure was so effective that Akhenaten's very location, was lost until the 19th century, when travelers and archaeologists, notably Flinders Petrie and others, identified the ruins at a site then called Amarna. Of course, today the site of Amarna is one of the most extensively excavated ancient cities in Egypt, providing an unparalleled snapshot of a city's layout and the daily life in 14th century BCE. Streets, villas of nobles, modest houses of workers, workshops, bakeries, and cemeteries, they all offer evidence into how people lived in Akhenaten's reign. Yet the mysteries still remain. There is one puzzle. That is the fate of Nefertiti, Akhenaten's chief queen, who was highly prominent in records up to a certain point, but then disappears. A little bit more on her later. But first, there's another about the succession after Akhenaten. Indications are that one or two co-regents, Semenkare and perhaps Nefertiti under another name, ruled briefly, but the historical details are a little hazy. The royal tomb at Amarna, intended for Akhenaten and his family, was found looted and possibly his mummy removed in antiquity. An unfinished side chamber in that tomb appears to have been either intended for Nefertiti or perhaps someone else, but it was never used, suggesting she either died elsewhere or was interred in a different location, a mystery we'll get back to later. Now, Akhenaten itself, after its abandonment, saw sporadic reoccupation. Tombs at Amarna show evidence of later burials, and even a brief revival as a Roman-era village centuries later. But essentially, Akhenaten was a ghost city, frozen in time. Its lost city mystique lies in how quickly it rose and fell, a spiritual utopia that lasted not even a generation. Why Akhenaten's religious revolution failed, we don't quite know. Was it simply unpopular, or did practical politics, the power of Amun's priesthood, doom it? That is still a debate. Perhaps going from having dozens and dozens of gods to just one was a bridge too far for the ordinary man on the street. Maybe. Amarna gives historians a lot of data, but it also tantalizes with what we cannot fully answer about the psychology of the era. Recent research at Amarna's commoners' cemetery reveals high instances of nutritional stress and manual labor injuries in the population, suggesting that the burden of the king's vision was weighing heavily on the ordinary people. And not everyone at Akhenaten might have been as fanatically devoted to Aten as the royal inscriptions proclaim. Excavators found household altars to traditional gods hidden in some houses. The city's DNA, climate, and archaeological analyses continue to yield a few insights, but the full story of Akhenaten's dramatic city and its equally dramatic collapse remains one of ancient history's most evocative enigmas. Of course, beyond these two examples, Egypt holds the other lost cities and sites. The legendary city of Et-Tawi, the Middle Kingdom capital of around 1900 BC, is still not definitely located, likely beneath fields in the Fayum region, just out there somewhere, awaiting discovery. In 2021, a team announced the stunning find of a 3,000-year-old city on Luxor's west bank, nicknamed the Golden City of Aten, dating to Amenhotep III's reign. Buried under sand near the Memnon Colossi, this well-preserved town had mud brick houses with furniture, bakeries with ovens and storage jars, and workshops with tools left as if inhabitants suddenly walked away. Early reports call it the largest ancient Egyptian city ever unearthed, likening its discovery to Pompeii. But why it was abandoned, that's quite unclear. We just don't know. Perhaps it was connected to the move to Amarna, as Amenhotep III's son was Akhenaten. In any case, excavations continue, and I dare say will continue for quite some time. And already, the lost Golden City is shedding light on an opulent period, with finds like jewelry, scarabs, and inscribed pots. Similarly, along the Mediterranean coast, Egypt's once thriving port cities, Tunis, Heraklion, and Canopus, sank beneath the sea, only to be detected by underwater archaeologists in the 2000s, complete with temples and statues preserved in silt. And these discoveries remind us that Egypt's map has been in flux for over a millennia. The whole urban centers have been relocated, renamed, or vanished due to environmental change or human decisions. Each lost city found is like resurrecting a chapter of history itself. Yet for every rediscovery, other ancient Egyptian cities remain elusive or only partially explored. The ongoing hunt for lost capitals and settlements, well, that's a real-life treasure hunt, guided by ancient texts, ground-penetrating radar, and sometimes just good old-fashioned sheer luck. In any case, as technology aids us in peering under sands and fields, we can certainly expect to discover more lost cities of Egypt to emerge, solving old mysteries, and at the same time, undoubtedly, raising a whole bunch of new ones. Right, so let's move on to tombs and burials. Egypt's practice of lavish burials for royalty and elites means that the desert is dotted with tombs. What it doesn't mean is that we've found them all. Some tombs remain quite elusive, or even puzzling in their contents, and it fuels quite a few expeditions and speculation. Likewise, some famous individual mummies are unaccounted for, which leaves quite a glaring gap in the historical record. So let's start with the first one, perhaps the most romanticized of the lost tombs, is that of Queen Cleopatra VII, the last pharaoh of Egypt. Cleopatra, together with her Roman lover Mark Antony, died in 30 BCE amid the aftermath of their defeat by Octavian, who would become the future Emperor Augustus. Classical writers describe Cleopatra's dramatic end, reportedly taking her own life with the assistance of an asp biting her, and say that Octavian permitted the Queen and Antony to be buried together. Well, that's all good and well, but where are they buried? Let's look at the ancient sources. They hint at a mausoleum in or near Alexandria, Cleopatra's capital. Alexandria, however, has been drastically transformed over 2,000 years. Earthquakes, tsunamis, and later eras submerged parts of the Ptolemaic city under the harbor, and all the rest lies beneath a modern metropolis. Good luck getting the permits to rip that down on a whim. But despite numerous searches, no confirmed trace of Cleopatra's tomb has surfaced in Alexandria. In recent years, an alternative possibility has somewhat captivated researchers. The temple site of Teposidis Magna, about 45 kilometers west of the site of Alexandria along the coast, rather. There, on a rocky ridge overlooking Lake Mariot, stand the ruins of a Ptolemaic-era temple to Osiris. Since 2005, Dominican archaeologist Dr. Kathleen Martinez has been excavating at Taposiris Magna with a theory that Cleopatra and Antony could have been interred in or near this temple, which was active in their time. But what is her reasoning? Basically, the reasoning is that Cleopatra had strong associations with the goddess Isis, who was Osiris's consort, and may have sought burial in the sanctuary of Osiris/Isis to emphasize her divine royalty. Now, the digs have indeed yielded a few exciting clues. A cache of coins bearing Cleopatra's likeness, a bust possibly of the queen, a statue of a priestess, and high-status burials in the temple vicinity. As early as 2022, Martinez and her team discovered a massive rock-cut tunnel, 13 meters underground, running for over 1,300 meters in length, which has been called a geometric miracle of engineering. Parts of this tunnel are now flooded by groundwater, but it does suggest that the temple complex had extensive subterranean passages. The Egyptian Ministry of Antiquities noted the tunnel's resemblance to an ancient Greek aqueduct, raising hopes it might lead to hidden chambers. So could Cleopatra's mausoleum lie at the end of this corridor, or in a submerged section? But that remains speculative. But the discovery does show that Taposiris Magna holds more than a few secrets. Nearby, Martinez found 2 gilded mummies of what might be important officials from Cleopatra's era, suggesting that the site was used for elite burials. If Cleopatra's tomb exists here, it might be intact, and that's a staggering prospect, given the fate of most of the pharaonic tombs. Zahi Hawass, the former Egyptian antiquities chief, commented that finding Cleopatra and Antony's tomb would be the most important discovery of the 21st century. But even if not found, the search itself has yielded significant artifacts and knowledge. As of now, what have we got? August 2025. Cleopatra's tomb remains undiscovered, one of the great archaeological riddles of our time. Whether it lies beneath Alexandria's urban sprawl, or in some seaside temple sanctuary, the allure of finding Cleopatra keeps the mystery very much alive. And then we have Nefertiti. Let's talk about her for a while. The famed great royal wife of Akhenaten, another legendary queen whose final resting place is a mystery. Nefertiti's elegant painted bust found at Amarna is one of the most recognizable artifacts of ancient Egypt. Yet, her mummy has never been conclusively identified, a fact often called the 3,300-year-old mystery of Nefertiti. During Akhenaten's reign, Nefertiti was depicted almost as a co-equal. She vanishes from the inscriptions in about year 12, leading to a myriad of theories. Maybe she died of the plague. Perhaps she fell out of favor. Or did she assume a new identity as Pharaoh? Some posit that she became the short-lived Pharaoh Semenkhare, or ruled as Neferneferuaten. When Tutankhamun later restored the old religion, he and his successors would have the motive to erase Nefertiti's memory as part of the Amarna heresy. But what really complicates the search is that Nefertiti might be one of several unidentified female mummies from the late 18th dynasty. That takes us back to 1898. Anatomist Grafton Elliott Smith found in tomb KV35 in the Valley of the Kings. That is what KV stands for, King's Valley. A side chamber with a jumble of royal mummies, apparently hidden by ancient priests in the Third Intermediate Period. Among them were a youthful female, dubbed the Younger Lady. Well, there was also an older woman, dubbed the Elder Lady, plus a prince. In any case, DNA analysis published in the year 2010 gave a pretty stunning result. You see, the Younger Lady in KV35 actually seems to have been Tutankhamun's mother. That's pretty interesting, isn't it? Well, and also the daughter of Amenhotep III and Queen Tai, and that makes her very likely a wife and sister of Akhenaten. Many suspect this younger lady, Mummy, is actually Nefertiti, as she fits being a wife of Akhenaten and a mother of Tutankhamun, though other candidates like Princess Merit-Aten or a secondary wife, Kia, have been suggested. Now, the mummy has a notable characteristic too. She was presumably beautiful, despite damage to the face by tomb robbers, and had an elongated skull feature consistent with Amarna royalty depictions. However, no inscription directly identifies her. Meanwhile, another clue emerged in the tomb of Tutankhamun KV 62. In 2015, Egyptologist Nicholas Reeves proposed that high-resolution scans of Tutankhamun's burial chamber walls showed faint lines that could indicate hidden doorways plastered over, possibly leading to an extension of the tomb. Reeves hypothesized that the small size of Tutankhamun's tomb was due to it originally being made for Nefertiti instead, and that her intact burial chamber might lie untouched behind a partition wall. Well, that is one idea, isn't it? Quite an interesting one. In any case, it prompted ground-penetrating radar scans inside the tomb in 2016. Initial scans were inconclusive, or suggested anomalies, but a more rigorous survey in 2018 by National Geographic and Politecnico Torino team found no evidence of hidden chambers, effectively refuting the theory. I know, it's pretty disappointing, but at least it answered one version of Nefertiti's tomb mystery, that she likely wasn't secreted away with Tutankhamun. The focus thus shifts back to the mummies in KV 35, or perhaps a burial at Amarna. Interestingly, Akhenaten's own burial is unresolved. A badly damaged coffin and body found in KV 55 is often thought to be Akhenaten, based on DNA and artifacts. But it's not 100% proven. Close, but not 100%. That being said, if KV 55 is Akhenaten, well, you might expect Nefertiti to have been moved to the Valley of the Kings as well. There are still unexamined leads. For instance, tomb KV 21 contained two unidentified female mummies from around Tut's era, one of which had DNA matching Tutankhamun's lineage, possibly Anaxinamun, Tutankhamun's wife, who was actually Nefertiti's daughter. Could the other be Nefertiti? DNA results have been inconclusive so far. There's only so much that can take us. The Egyptian authorities have been actively pursuing this mystery too. In 2022, Zahi Hawass announced that his team had been conducting DNA comparisons on unidentified mummies, and he believed that they were quite close to confirming the identity of Nefertiti. He suggested an announcement might be forthcoming once results are validated. If Nefertiti's mummy is indeed among those in Cairo Museum's cache like KV-35 younger lady, a DNA fingerprint might soon solve the puzzle definitively. But until then, the fate of Nefertiti and her final resting place remains one of the great mysteries of Egyptology, a case of a famous person lost in that shuffle of history, maybe hiding in plain sight amidst all the other remains. Solving it would not only satisfy curiosity about her, but also clarify the tangled relations of the Amarna royal house. In any case, for now, the beautiful queen continues to elude us in death, just as much as she fascinated us in her life. But of course, Cleopatra and Nefertiti are the most celebrated women with lost tombs. But there are plenty of other notable missing burials. And I'm sure you've been waiting for me to talk about Alexander the Great. Now, although he was a Macedonian conqueror, he did die in Egypt, 323 BC, in Babylon rather, but his body was brought to Alexandria. So, not quite died in Egypt, but was certainly brought back there. In any case, his tomb in Alexandria became a shrine for centuries. But then, in late antiquity, it just vanished. Despite numerous claims of finding Alexander's tomb, no one has really been able to authenticate it, leaving one of history's greatest conquerors essentially in the missing pile, comfortably in there with Cleopatra and a few others. Then we have Imhotep, the architect of the first pyramid, that is, Djoser's step pyramid, and later deified as a god of wisdom, is said by tradition to have been buried at Saqqara. But despite intensive searches, his tombs have never been identified. If discovered, it would be quite a momentous find, sure you agree, potentially full of insights into Old Kingdom knowledge. There are also unlocated tombs of certain pharaohs. For example, Thutmose II of the 18th dynasty's tomb in the Valley of the Kings is unaccounted for, as is that of Ramesses VIII in the 20th dynasty. The Valley of the Kings, though thoroughly explored, still has a lot of surprises for us. KV5 is one of them, the largest tomb in the valley with over 120 chambers built for the sons of Ramesses II, was only rediscovered in the 1990s after being dismissed as unimportant previously. In 2006, a small tomb, KV63, was found near Tutankhamun's, containing coffins and mummification materials. Though there was no mummy in there, it seems to have been an embalming cache or a storeroom. Still, pretty cool. Well, this was the first new tomb found in the valley since 1922, and that is proof that persistence certainly pays off. But many suspect more small tombs or caches remain to be found in the Theban cliffs. One particularly poignant lost burial is that of Queen Ankhesenamun, Tutankhamun's young widow, and Nefertiti's daughter. Historical records suggest that she married Ai, Tut's successor, and then just disappears. In 2017, radar scans in the Valley of the Kings near Ai's tomb detect a possible subsurface anomaly that some hope could be Ankhesenamun's tomb. Excavations in 2009 revealed evidence of foundation trenches, including a tomb entrance, but as of last reports, no tomb has been fully excavated there yet. But the possibility is still open, so there's that. And while dozens of royal mummies have been recovered, often in cached tombs where the New Kingdom priests hid them from looters, a few royal mummies are still missing. For instance, we've not definitively found the mummy of not the money of Amenhotep I. That was an 18th dynasty king. Although a mummy labeled as him was found in a cache, it remains wrapped and unexamined due to its pristine wrappings. Don't want to disturb something like that. The 19th century pharaoh Seti II's mummy was possibly identified, but with some uncertainty. Each unidentified mummy in museum collections could be one of these missing individuals, and solving those identities is an ongoing detective project, using CT scans, DNA, and, of course, the forensic technology, the best that we have for our current modern age. But besides wholly missing tombs, there are tombs that were found, but, well, they raise a few questions. One example is tomb KV55 in the Valley of the Kings. Discovered back in 1907, it contained a confusing assemblage. A desecrated coffin of a man, but with a queen's gilt mask, jars with the name of Akhenaten's mother Tai, and inscriptions partially hacked out. The mummy in the coffin turned out to be a relatively young male, and many believe this was Akhenaten's makeshift burial. But because the inscriptions were erased, debate persisted for decades whether the mummy really was Akhenaten, Sementkare, or perhaps just another minor prince. But then DNA tests in 2010 showed the KV-55 mummy is Tutankhamun's father and the son of Amenhotep III, which essentially confirms it as Akhenaten. So in this case, a mystery tomb has been largely resolved by modern science, yet this circumstance of the burial, why such a hasty and defaced interment, reflect a tumultuous aftermath of Akhenaten's reign. Another intriguing tomb is KV-62, that is Tutankhamun's own tomb, not for being lost, but because it might hold a secret. As discussed, the theory of an additional chamber, possibly for Nefertiti, captures quite a lot of attention. And while current evidence discounts a hidden room, Tutankhamun's tomb still has peculiar aspects. Many of his grave goods seem originally made for someone else. Several items name his predecessor, Neferuaten, possibly Nefertiti. His golden death mask's facial features appear to be reworked from an earlier owner. And these clues suggest that Tutankhamun's sudden death at about 19 years old forced officials to repurpose Nefertiti's funerary equipment for him. And if so, Nefertiti's intended tomb in Amarna or elsewhere was dismantled, and her body relocated, perhaps to KV-35 as we suspect. Tutankhamun's tomb thereby indirectly whispers hints about the fate of Nefertiti, a fascinating case where one tomb's content provides puzzle pieces for the mystery of another tomb. Finally, there are legendary tombs like the so-called Hall of Records, a conjectural library said to be hidden under the Great Sphinx of Giza, rumored by mystics but never found by archaeologists. Extensive drilling and scanning around the Sphinx have revealed only some natural cavities and a small dead-end tunnel. While mainstream scholars dismiss the Hall of Records as a fable, the notion taps into a broader theme. Might some tombs or chambers still lie hidden in famous monuments containing papyri or artifacts that revolutionize our knowledge? As shown by these scan pyramids discoveries, it is plausible that royal tomb builders incorporated sealed voids or caches that we've yet to find. For example, some suspect that there may be undiscovered storage chambers in or around the tomb of Pharaoh Seti I, that is KV-17, which is the longest and one of the most lavishly decorated tombs. A recently discovered tunnel in that tomb extends deeper underground, and its end is still not reached due to safety concerns. These tomb mysteries, as we can call them, keep Egyptologists very busy, and of course very enthused. And you must remember too that we are in an era where technology can finally solve these age-old questions, as well as an era where cultural heritage authorities exercise caution to preserve what is found. It's not like 100 years ago when you would just be selling it on the black market, or even grinding mummies up for medicine. Yes, perhaps a topic for a different video. In any case, the Valley of the Kings is still holding its breath, perhaps to yield one more royal burial to one lucky excavator. After all, if they can find the Rosetta Stone just by sifting through the sand with their bare hands, just imagine what they can find with the best technology of 2025. In any case, the next thing we're going to talk about is a little bit on a smaller scale. It's not a great king or queen. It's not a giant pyramid. We're talking about the more hidden treasures, the unexplained little artifacts, and of course to some of those texts that are quite puzzling. First, let's talk about the Saqqara bird. Well, that story starts in 1898. This peculiar object was found in a tomb at Saqqara, a small wooden figure resembling a bird with outstretched wings. It has the general shape of a falcon, about 18 centimeters across, carved from a sycamore wood, with a vertical tail, but notably it lacks the detailed feathers or feet typical of a bird statuette. Well, initially it was catalogued as a wooden bird, of course, likely a toy or a votive offering, from the Ptolemaic period, that is around 200 BCE. However, in the mid-20th century, some enthusiasts noted that the artifact's aerodynamics looked a bit more like a modern glider. They noticed it had a fuselage-like body and curved wings. And of course, well, this led to a pretty sensational hypothesis that the Saqqara bird is actually a model of an aircraft, and that ancient Egyptians had developed the principles of flight. Well, some experiments with replicas showed that it can glide short distances when launched, further fueling these fringe theories. However, rigorous analysis by aeronautical engineers and Egyptologists certainly debunks this notion. The Saqqara bird lacks any tail rudder or horizontal stabilizer that a true aircraft would need for controlled flight. Computational modeling in 2023 confirmed that the artifact is aerodynamically unstable and has a very poor lift-to-drag ratio. In fact, to make it glide in modern tests, people had to add a rudder piece that the original does not have. Well, that is, of course, a clear sign that the design was not intended as a scale model of a flying machine. Mainstream scholars instead interpret the object within its context. It was found in a tomb dedicated to the god Ptah, and the bird is likely a representation of a falcon, symbol of the god Horus or the soul in flight. Similar wooden birds and bird-shaped gliders were used as toys or ritual items in Egypt at the time. A plausible purpose is that it served as a votive offering, perhaps a ceremonial boomerang or a weather vane, or an object placed into the tomb to magically fly the soul of the deceased toward the heavens. The falcon was a common motive for royalty and divinity, so a wooden falcon in a tomb is not really unusual. Thus, while the Saqqara bird is a fascinating artifact, even a poignant one, symbolizing humanity's eternal dream of flight, well, it's not evidence of Egyptian airplanes. They would have to wait until Egypt Air came in for that much later, I'm afraid. Well, it reminds us that an ancient object can resemble something familiar to us, of course, like a toy plane. But to the ancients it had a completely different meaning. So we have to look at it all in that context, and we have to be quite cautious not to jump to conclusions. Now, speaking of jumping to conclusions, deep within the temple of Hathor at Dendera, tourists are shown carvings on the walls of a crypt that, with a bit of imagination, look strikingly like oversized light bulbs. That's right, just like the modern ones that we have in our era of 2025. In these reliefs, an elongated oval shape with a serpent inside is held up by a pillar-shaped object, and a priest figure is shown presenting it. Popular writers and tour guides seized on this imagery to propose that the Egyptians actually had electric lighting, pointing to the Dendera light as evidence of a crook and flail-shaped filament inside a bulb-like glass, perhaps by the so-called Baghdad Battery, a separate Middle Eastern artifact often speculated to be a galvanic cell. However, this interpretation falls apart under the scrutiny of accompanying hieroglyphs and the Egyptian religious symbolism. The Dendera reliefs actually depict scenes of the creation myth and the interplay of the Egyptian gods. This bulb, if we want to call it that, is actually a hen container, womb or lotus bud, from which the snake representing the god Harsomptus emerges. The pillar supporting it is a jed pillar, symbolizing the stability and associated with Osiris. In this context, it probably signalized the energized, life-giving force. The human figures are not electricians, but rather priests and deities. In essence, these carvings show the serpent deity Harsomptus rising from a lotus blossom, shining with the light of creation within a symbolic container often interpreted as the night bark or the womb of the sky goddess. They appear in a crypt, which was likely used to ritually recharge cult statues in darkness, equating the confined space to the primeval darkness before creation. The hieroglyphic captions around the relief made no mention of anything technical. They speak of gods and mystical energies, not wires or batteries. And in fact, one relief explicitly shows the jed pillar with human arms lifting the, quote, light serpent in lotus, a clear religious motive. Egyptologists have thoroughly debunked the light bulb theory, ruining the fun as always, I'm afraid. The snake within the oval is the form of Harsomptus, and the entire scene is part of a series of crypt reliefs describing secret ceremonies. And of course, if the Egyptians had electric light, one might ask, why did they continue to use oil lamps and torches in all of the other contexts and leave no actual artifacts of electrical remains? Good question, right? In fact, the Dendera light bulb is a prime example of how modern eyes can misinterpret ancient art when taken out of context. But it is a fascinating visual resemblance, I'll give you that, albeit a purely coincidental one. Now, the next one we have is the unsolved enigma of the schist disk of Sabu. This one takes us to 1936, and Walter Emery was excavating at Saqqara, that is the tomb of Prince Sabu in the first dynasty, circa 3000 BCE. And well, Mr. Emery found quite a curious object. A round disc of 61 centimeters in diameter, made of solid schist, that is a brittle stone, with 3 evenly spaced lobed blades curving inward from the rim towards the central hub. This Sabu disc, as it's called, looks like no other artifact from its time. It resembles a 3-bladed propeller or a complicated wheel. In any case, its function is unknown. It might have been the stand or foot of a ceremonial bowl or brazier. Emery thought it could be part of a vessel or lamp, given it had a central hole and was found near remains of other vessels. However, producing such a shape out of hard stone with the era's tools would have been exceptionally difficult, leading some to speculate it was copied from a metal prototype, since carving those thin lobes in stone is quite risky. Naturally, fringe theorists have jumped on the Sabu disc as evidence of an advanced technology, calling it a machine part or turbine, or even an ancient power wheel. But no other such discs have been found, and there's no indication it was anything more than a piece of ritual furniture or decoration. And the context, a high-status tomb, suggests it might have been a unique luxury object. Possibly it was the stand for a large pot or offering dish, the lobes being ornamental as handles or supports. Some early reports fancifully dubbed it a lamp, implying it might have held oils and wicks, but no soot or residue was noted, so, well, there goes that theory, unless they never lit the thing, in which case, why would they not light it? In truth, the Sabu disc remains unique and not well understood, so we have to remain a little open-minded. But it does show the high craftsmanship of early dynastic Egyptians, and hints that many objects from that age may not have survived or been discovered yet, making this one appear quite anomalous. In any case, the mystery disc invites us to avoid making hasty conclusions from isolated finds. Scholars continue to examine it, but without parallels it's pretty hard to interpret. So while the tabloids might label it an Egyptian UFO part, Archaeologists lean more towards a mundane purpose that simply just does not have a modern equivalent. Of course, next thing we need to talk about is a few of the more cryptic inscriptions that we have. Of course, we know that Egypt was a literate civilization. Well, Egypt is, rather, we could say ancient Egypt was a literate civilization. They haven't gone that downhill, I'm sure. Well, one of its greatest mysteries for centuries, however, was the writing system itself. Hieroglyphs. Of course, you don't just have hieroglyphs, you've got demotic, but everybody knows hieroglyphs anyway. Now, until the Rosetta Stone was deciphered by Champollion in 1822, hieroglyphic texts were just a big mystery, indecipherable, and of course this spawned many mystical interpretations in the interim. Someone had to give an answer somewhere, of course, right? Well, today we can read them, but that doesn't mean that we can say we understand everything that the Egyptians wrote. It's a little bit more niche than that, I'm afraid. Some texts are obscure on purpose. For instance, certain royal tombs, like that of Seti I, feature passages written in cryptographic hieroglyphs, a form of code where standard signs are replaced with rare or enigmatic ones, perhaps only known to priests. These might have been meant to hide sacred names or formulas from the uninitiated, perhaps. Probably something like that. We don't quite know, but that seems to be what's going on. Now, in terms of decoding these cryptograms, that is a real challenge. But Egyptologists never shy away from a challenge, you know that, and they've cracked many of them by finding parallel texts written in a more normal manner. Another linguistic enigma lies in the very sounds of the Egyptian language. The hieroglyphic script recorded mostly consonants, and that leaves out the vowels. So while we can translate and transliterate the words, we don't often know the exact pronunciation, which is a little bit frustrating. Reconstructing vocalizations involves comparative linguistics, so we're talking about Coptic and other Afro-Asiatic languages, and of course a little bit of educated guesswork. The true pronunciation of Pharaoh's names or spells is an unknown in a sense. If we heard an Egyptian speak in the ancient times, we might comprehend the meaning, but we might be surprised by the actual sound. Now, in terms of religious texts, they pose their own puzzles. The Book of the Dead, a New Kingdom collection of spells to guide the deceased, is relatively well understood, but some spells contain allusions or divine names whose significance is still a debate. A famous example is spell 17 of the Book of the Dead, which was so ancient and obscure that the papyri often include a gloss or commentary by the scribe himself trying to explain it. Even the Egyptians, centuries after the original compositions, sometimes struggled with their own archaic religious texts, and if it was old and confusing to them, well, what hope have we got? In any case, the pyramid texts of the Old Kingdom, that is subscribed from the 5th to 6th dynasty pyramids, include the so-called cannibal hymn, lines describing the pharaoh in the afterlife, devouring parts of the gods to absorb their power. Now, this is a pretty bizarre imagery, and it led early scholars to conjecture about ritual cannibalism, but, well, now it's interpreted metaphorically as a way to respect the king's dominance over the gods. The exact nuance of such texts can be hard to pin down. Are they literal, or are they symbolic? Well, in the case of the cannibal hymn, consensus leans strongly to symbolic, but it does show how at the fringes of translation, mystery and conjecture still remains. Egypt's certainly not something where we can certainly close the book and say, well, that's that. I think we've got another couple hundred years of trying to figure things out completely. But one of the most intriguing religious enigmas is the great hymn to the Aten from Amarna, and that was composed by Akhenaten himself. This long poem, found in the tomb of an official named Ai, praises the Aten, that is the sun disk, as the sole creator and sustainer of life. It has uncanny parallels to Psalm 104 in the Bible too, by the way. Both describe the world's creatures walking with the sun and the sun setting and bringing darkness, among a few other motifs. Did the great hymn influence Hebrew poetry, or is that just a big coincidence? Scholars debate possible connections. Direct influence is unproven, but it does raise the tantalizing idea that Akhenaten's short-lived monotheism might have echoes beyond Egypt. The hymn itself is poetic and beautiful, yet its deeper theological intention, well, was Akhenaten truly a monotheist, denying all the other gods? Or was he just elevating Aten as the chief god in a henotheistic way? Well, that, of course, is another topic that is still discussed. Just like religion in modern contexts, well, this has just as many interpretations as you'd expect. Some argue that Akhenaten's language is explicitly monotheistic. Others note he still allowed mentions of other gods like Re in the early years. In any case, the precise nature of his religious thought is a historical mystery tied to textual interpretation. Now, in the realm of hidden texts, there is the persistent legend of the lost knowledge hidden in the Egyptian monuments, the idea of a secret library or archive, perhaps under the Sphinx. The aforementioned Hall of Records is one that comes to mind, or in a lost wadi, and that still captivates the imagination, that's for sure. While these specific romantic notions lack evidence, Egypt did have libraries and archives, like the House of Life in temples, which could contain scrolls of literature, medicine, and magic, what have you. Pretty much anything, really. It depended on what what they wanted to put in there. There was no rules. But many of those have unfortunately not survived. Occasionally a cache of papyri is found that vastly increases our knowledge, etc. The papyrus Salt 830 that contains a trove of magical spells, or the Brooklyn Medical Papyrus with therapeutic recipes. And each discovery is like finding a puzzle piece behind the couch, thought that we lost forever. A notable find in recent years is the Cairo calendar, that is Papyrus Cairo 86637, essentially a hieratic papyrus that's a day-by-day almanac of lucky and unlucky days with mythic reference. Translating and interpreting these allusions is still ongoing, but it certainly opens a window into how Egyptians thought of time and fate. Another mysterious text is the Book of Thoth, often referenced in later sources as a compendium of secret knowledge written by the god Thoth himself, containing powerful spells, of course. The only thing you'd expect from Thoth. Well, it does appear in a Ptolemaic tale of a prince who finds a magic book in an underwater chest only to suffer tragedy, suggesting a moral that some knowledge should be kept forbidden. And while it is, well, likely fictional, the Book of Thoth concept might be based on a real collection of papyri. In fact, a set of demotic papyri from Greco-Roman Egypt containing initiation dialogues and teachings has been nicknamed the Book of Thoth by modern scholars. It might represent a priestly training text. In any case, its fragmentary state and cryptic content make it a challenge to understand, showing that even when we have texts, they can still be quite mysterious, especially if we lack the context. Many Egyptian symbols, too, the Ankh, life, the Jet, stability, and the Was, scepter, power, have known general meanings, yet their precise origins and ritual use remains the mystery. The Jet pillar, for example, was raised in ceremonies likely symbolizing the resurrection of Osiris. Well, but was the Jet originally a bundle of sheaves? A representation of a spinal column, or perhaps something else? We don't know. Competing theories do exist, though. The ibis-headed Toth and baboon often appear with unclear symbolism. Egyptian ritual practices like mummification have largely been decoded by archaeology, but some steps or purposes remain debated, etc. The exact use of certain amulets or why the brain was discarded. Or did they truly think the brain was unimportant, or was it a more pragmatic choice, etc.? Well, even the construction of obelisks, that massive single stone pillar monuments, they pose a technological mystery. We know that they quarried them and likely dragged them on sleds, but the final process, standing them upright, has been hypothesized with various methods, without a definitive universal agreement, because no explicit description by Egyptians has survived. So I'm afraid we're left up to our own devices. And then finally, for our section, magical and funerary artifacts. Items like the Mehen game, a mysterious board game with a coiled snake pattern found in early dynastic tombs, are still not fully understood in terms of rules and significance. Was it purely recreational, or perhaps a ritual thing? Once again, we don't know. And then we have the famous Nama palette from 3100 BCE, with its intricate iconography of kings and gods, purely commemorative of the unification of Egypt, or did it serve a ceremonial function for grinding cosmetics in a temple context? We do assume the latter, though, but the palette's precise ceremonial use, well, that remains once again a bit of educated guesswork. Okay, now I promised that I'd talk about Nefertiti a bit more, and I'm not so rude as to break a promise. So, the beautiful one has come. That's what her name means, by the way, Nefertiti. Perhaps she is among the most famous women of the ancient world. Everyone knows the name, sure, but the story's filled with quite a few gaps and mysteries. Let's start with the basics. She was the great wife of Akhenaten and played a role in his religious revolution. In imagery and inscriptions from the early Amarna period, she is depicted almost as Akhenaten's equal. She appears smiting enemies, wearing the pharaoh's crown and officiating temple rituals to Aten, so definitely not a backseat character, that's for sure. Now her beauty, immortalized by the painted bust found in a sculptor's workshop at Amarna, has made her an icon. Well, let's start from her reign. The origins are a bit obscure, we will admit that, and some evidence suggests that she was the daughter of Ai, and possibly a woman named Te, which would make her of non-royal birth, but still of aristocratic lineage. Other theories propose she was a Mitanni princess, because her name is Tadukipa in that scenario. However, consensus leans more towards her being a native Egyptian. She married Amenhotep IV, that is, Akhenaten, likely as a teenager, and bore him 6 daughters, with very long and difficult names. Creative, though. Let's give myself a challenge. Let's see if I can pronounce them, okay? Meritaten, Meketaten, Kesenpaten, later Ankesenamun, Neferneferuaten, Tashrit, Neferneferure, and Setepenre. Well, that was the most difficult part of the video, wasn't it? Okay, moving on. Well, no sons are recorded from Nefertiti, and that might be why Akhenaten took secondary wives from whom he had Tutankhaten, which of course became Tutankhamun later on. Well, during the first half of Akhenaten's reign, Nefertiti's name appears frequently on boundary stelae, official inscriptions, and the famous murals of the royal family under Aten's rays. But after roughly year 12 or 13, her name disappears from the historical record. One of their daughters, Meketaten, died. Her burial is depicted in the royal tomb, with Nefertiti shown mourning, so she was obviously still around at that point. well then Nefertiti is no longer mentioned. Several scenarios have been suggested, the first being she died from some cause. Plague speculated. An epidemic did strike Egypt back then, many people say. Also, she might have fell from favor with Akhenaten. And thirdly, she might have changed her name and status to become co-regent or even sole ruler after Akhenaten. And the third scenario is the particularly intriguing one. Of course, there are other inscriptions referring to a figure which people initially thought to be Smenkhare, a male co-regent, but certain feminine endings and the epithet of the different naming convention, beneficent in her husband's reign, strongly suggest that it was actually Nefertiti taking a kingly naming convention. And if that is so, Nefertiti might have become effectively a female pharaoh while Akhenaten was still alive, or perhaps immediately after. Well, we know now that Smenkhare, if a different person, died young and left, well, not very much impact, I'm afraid. One theory is that Nefertiti and Smenkhare could have even been the same person, i.e., Nefertiti assumed a male persona. Now that's not confirmed, but it's one way to interpret the scarce evidence. But what is clear is that just a few years before Akhenaten's death, there was something of a sharing of transfer of power. If Nefertiti did rule briefly in her own right, she would be one of the few women to do so in Egypt. And notably, of course, later, Tutankhamun's widow, Ankhesenamun, may have also attempted to wield influence, as suggested by letters to the Hittites. Nefertiti's end remains unknown, too. Did she die at Amarna and get buried there? The royal tomb's unfinished side chamber, perhaps meant for her, suggests that she was intended to be buried in Amarna if she died during Akhenaten's reign, but no mummy or identifying inscription was found there. Well, this implies that she was never interred in that tomb. But if she lived beyond Akhenaten, perhaps she relocated back to Thebes and eventually lived out her days there, a tomb and body hidden to protect them from any backlash. Some have suggested Nefertiti could be the elder lady found in KV-35, as we identified before. And, the younger lady, too, in KV-35 is discussed as another candidate. But the consensus leans that the younger lady is Tutankhaten's mother, which could be Nefertiti if Nefertiti was his biological mother. However, many think that Tutankhamun's mother was another wife, Kia, or a sister of Akhenaten. The DNA from the younger lady indicates she was a daughter of Amenhotep III and Tai, which Nefertiti was not if she was Ai's daughter. Therefore, the prevailing view is younger lady is likely Akhenaten's full sister, which could be a woman named Nebeta, or one of her sisters, not Nefertiti. Now this leaves Nefertiti's mummy unaccounted for, unless she is the occupant of some yet identified burial. Maybe tomb KV-21A if DNA can be clarified. Well, hopefully I'll be making another video in 5 years' time which clarifies all of that. Who knows, we're discovering stuff at a pretty alarming rate lately, so it's good. In any case, this other perplexing aspect is that Nefertiti's name was not totally erased by later pharaohs, whereas Akhenaten's was. Now why is that? It could be simply because they forgot about her, or because she changed her name to Neferuaten, and that name was erased instead. Indeed, someone chiseled out references to that name on items in Tutankhamun's tomb, indicating that name was proscribed. So, if that was Nefertiti's throne name, they did attempt to remove her too, only directly. It took modern Egyptology a long time to realize that Neferuaten might be Nefertiti, and that shows how effectively the information was suppressed. Alright, so let's end it on let's end it at the end, I suppose. Because, well, the end of the Ptolemaic dynasty, the last pharaoh, Cleopatra, or rather Cleopatra the Seventh, one of the most storied figures of antiquity. A queen whose life and death has been retold in literature, film, and drama. The Elizabeth Taylor film is my favorite. Yet disentangling the myth from the reality is a bit of a challenge, and archaeological evidence of Cleopatra's reign from 51 to 30 BCE is surprisingly rare given her fame. The political context of the time is well documented by Greco-Roman historians. We all know she was the last active ruler of the Ptolemaic kingdom of Egypt, a descendant of Ptolemy, who navigated a tumultuous era where Rome's civil wars spilled into Egypt. Cleopatra's unsolved mysteries mostly revolve around her death and burial, but even as aspects of her life, her true character, appearance, and intentions are subjects of debate and reinterpretation. Well, Cleopatra came to the throne at 18, co-ruling with her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, whom she got married to, per custom. Yeah, just the way it is. Far be it for me to put my morality onto others. She was very well educated, though. In fact, the Ptolemies were of Macedonian Greek origin, but Cleopatra famously learned the Egyptian language and presented herself as a reincarnation of the goddess Isis, certainly fitting into the local culture. Good on her. But she was likely multilingual, versed in politics, philosophy, and science of the time. Ancient writers like Plutarch praise her wit and charm, emphasizing that her allure lay more in her intelligence and eloquence rather than in her classical beauty. She astutely allied herself with Julius Caesar when he arrived in Alexandria, chasing Pompey in 58 BCE, and that colorful story of her being smuggled to Caesar, rolled up in a carpet, seems to be quite legendary. She became Caesar's lover, and bore him a son, Ptolemy the 15th, also known as Caesarion. Caesar's assassination in 44 BC left her in a pretty sticky spot, I'm afraid, quite precarious. But soon after, she aligned with Mark Antony, effectively monkey branching quite quickly from one bloke to the next, and perhaps envisioned carving out an Eastern empire with him. Well, their famous love and political alliance culminated in the donations of Alexandria in 34 BCE, where they distributed lands to their children, an act that alarmed Octavian and the Roman Senate alike. Of course, the climax was the Battle of Actium, 31 BCE, where Octavian's forces defeated Antony and Cleopatra's navy. Returning to Egypt, with Octavian closing in, both Antony and Cleopatra took their own lives in August of 30 BCE. Antony fell on his sword, and Cleopatra traditionally was stung by the bite of an asp, but once again, here lies in a small mystery. Did she really die by an asp? Or was it a romanticized tale? We don't know. Some historians argue that a snake bite as a life-taking method is quite unreliable. Cobra venom can kill, but not instantly and not always. Alternative theories are that she ingested a fast-acting poison. Classical accounts, Plutarch and Cassius Dio, say that she carried poisons on her just in case, tested them on prisoners to find the least painful, and eventually used either an asp hidden in a basket of figs or a toxic ointment. Perhaps we'll never know the truth, but the consensus is she arranged her own death to avoid humiliation of being paraded in Octavian's triumph. After all, nobody wants that. Octavian was, however, reportedly quite annoyed at being robbed at showing her in chains, but he ensured that her children, except Caesarion, who was executed, were spared. Now, as for Cleopatra's tomb, Octavian permitted Cleopatra and Antony to be buried together, which implies they had a tomb prepared, likely in Alexandria. Classical sources mention a mausoleum Cleopatra had built for herself in her last days. She even retreated into it with her treasure before surrendering. The mausoleum's location is not described in detail, but presumably it was in the royal quarter of Alexandria, near the great Ptolemaic palaces by the harbor. Over time, of course, the geography of Alexandria has changed dramatically. Earthquakes in the 4th and 8th centuries, and tsunamis submerging the royal quarters, the area called Cape Locaius, and the nearby island of Antirodos, where Cleopatra's palace may have stood, are all underwater. Marine archaeologist Frank Gaudio has found some remains of this quarter underwater, columns, statuary, and even possibly Cleopatra's palace foundations, and a palace of the earlier Queen Arsinoe. So one possibility is that Cleopatra's tomb is now under the harbor, entombed in sediment, 2,000 years worth of it. Good luck digging through that. And if so, aquatic archaeology might one day identify it. But given the vastness of the submerged area, and the fact that many Ptolemaic tombs might have been plundered or destroyed in late antiquity, it is a long shot, a very long shot. But this does lead us to an alternative search location, Taposiris Magna. We discussed it a little bit earlier. Well, while Cleopatra's tomb should logically be located in Alexandria, the notion that she might have been buried in a sacred site outside the city has some rationale. The Ptolemies sometimes built or used secondary religious capitals. Cleopatra, in her self-styling as Isis, may have sought burial in a temple of Isis to merge with that divine myth. And of course, the temple has yielded coinage of her era, as we discussed, and it's approximately 45 kilometers away from Alexandria, so not too far away. If her tomb survived anywhere in doubt, a solid argument is that it would be at a site that later fell out of use and was well away from the urban destruction of Alexandria. Anyway, we'll hope that the excavations continue. Now, just finally, another debate around Cleopatra is her ethnicity and appearance. The Ptolemies were of Greek origin, and they practiced sibling marriage. Cleopatra was a Macedonian Greek by ancestry, with possibly some Persian and Syrian, though earlier Seleucid, intermarriage. It's often speculated that her mother or grandmother might have been Egyptian, but there's no solid evidence of that. The Ptolemies mostly intermarried within their family or Hellenistic royals, so ethnically Cleopatra was not Egyptian in lineage, but culturally she was very much both Greek and Egyptian. She embraced the Egyptian language and religion to legitimize herself to her subjects, something that many Ptolemies had not bothered to do. You see, they spoke Greek and ruled from Alexandria somewhat detached. Just a job, basically. Now, what about in terms of looks? Well, coins in her reign show her profile with a prominent nose and chin. Whether that was stylized for authority or realistic details is debated. We have a few busts believed to be Cleopatra. They portray a woman with a Hellenistic-style face, a broad forehead, aquiline nose. The Berlin Cleopatra head and a damaged one in the Vatican are examples. But none are as stunning as the Nefertiti bust. Hence, the idea that Cleopatra's beauty was not about physical perfection but her presence and intellect, as ancient writers noted, is the prevailing idea. And of course, modern media often portrays her as glamorous, from Theda Bara to Elizabeth Taylor. And, well, I suppose I have to mention it. 2020, the controversy about BBC potentially casting a mixed-race actress, touching on the complexities of Cleopatra's identity in a modern imagination. There's always that famous quote from that woman on there saying, "My grandmother told me, I don't care what anyone tells you, Cleopatra was black," which is just not correct. I mean, it's just not. In truth, Cleopatra was a Macedonian Greek woman, perhaps with some Egyptian features if her maternal lineage had a little bit of local blood. But in any case, does it really matter? She fashioned her image as Egypt's queen. On temple walls, she appears in the traditional pharaonic style, which to the Egyptians meant she was their legitimate ruler and not a foreigner. And in the Dendera temple, there are reliefs of Cleopatra as a pharaoh alongside her son Caesarion, showing her claim as part of the dynastic continuity. In any case, whether she was black or white or whatever it was, the Egyptians at the time still would have seen her as a foreign ruler, because she wasn't Egyptian. And on that note, that's where we ended off today. It was only meant to be a 1-hour video, but I just really couldn't help myself. I just had to keep going with it. The script just kept running, didn't it? But that's all right, because we had fun, and we learned a lot. So if you're still up, and you're still listening, leave me a comment, something interesting, perhaps your thoughts on the mysteries of Egypt. In any case, I'm going to thank my top-tier patrons, making this all possible to be ad-free. We've got Kimberly, who's been a member for a year and a half now. Absolutely. Lots of old members, right? So we got Kimberly, Christine, Sally, Ember, Susan, Cameron, Gary, Charlene, Linteries, Katiana, Nicholas, Ulfidnir, Alexander, Charles, Christine, Dr. Neuronerd, Erin, Jaden, Jim, Jeffrey, Jessica, Madeline, Melissa, Orthodox Review, Scott, Shell, Wendy, Josie, Sarah, Ryan, Thor, Cameron, Stefan, Kevin, HMSHH, Crystal, Talbury, Anthony, Lucy, Brandon, Cuckoo Bubonic, Nicholas, Craig, Nephthys, Alexander, Gokan, Dorsey, Benita, Claire, Courtesy, Carol, Robert, Mary, Bridget, Nefertari, Yvette, Miss Mochi, 11, Allison, Free American, Jennifer, Brittany, David, Cody, Brian, Are You My Mum, Rhonda, Carrie, Catty B, Lovely, and Poma. All right. Okay, that's enough for me tonight. I'm going to go have a bit of ice cream, I think. I think I've deserved that. All right, everyone. Good night. Lots of love to you all. And I will see you when you feel like returning. You know where I'll be. Farewell for now.